You don't need to play the victim when you are a victim. Sadly, the Jewish people have been the millennia-old whipping post and anti-Semitism indelible stain on humanity. Tomorrow evening, as Rabbi Steele noted, marks the holiday of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av. It is considered the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. Tisha B'Av marks the destruction of both temples in Jerusalem, along with other tragedies. Not all Jewish tragedies, but at the core, Jewish tragedies. The date Jews were expelled from England, expelled from Spain, and the date that both World War I and World War II began. The point being, we can sum up Tisha B'Av with one word: tsuris. We traditionally read from the biblical book Echa, the book of Lamentations. The book is attributed to the prophet Jeremiah, who witnessed the siege and destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. Lamentations is a collection of 5 funeral poems intended for each generation to remember what it must have felt like losing the temple, the heartbeat of the Jewish people. Remembering our story as a people and reliving it each year is a cornerstone of survival. Jews remember what it is to be victimized. It's core to our story. Yet, here's one of the most remarkable characteristics about being Jewish. We turn our tsuris into a moral compass. We were victimized as slaves in Egypt for 400 years. The Exodus story is our redemption story from slavery to freedom. We sing, as we did tonight, every single day, Michamocha ba'elim Adonai. And what do we do with our story? We make it our foundational narrative that obligates us to stand with and fight side by side any enslaved people. We can hear the biblical words echo across the generations. You shall not oppress a stranger, as you yourself know the feelings of a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. As Jews, we are not truly free until all of God's children, and that's everyone, are free. Turning tsuris into a moral compass is even more boldly on display on Tisha B'Av. The rabbis cast victimhood in a dramatically different light. They challenge our human nature to the core. So here's the paraphrased rabbinic story known as Kamsa Bar Kamsa. Once upon a time, a wealthy, well-connected Jewish man threw a party in Jerusalem, including the prominent rabbis in the community. He meant to invite his dear friend, whose name was Kamsa. And mistakenly, the invitation was delivered to the host's enemy, whose name was Bar Kamsa. Are you with me so far? Though surprised to receive the invite, to be sure, Bar Kamsa thought, perhaps the host may be extending an olive branch to move towards some peaceful reconciliation. The host, aghast to see his enemy at the party, immediately in front of all the guests, asked him to leave. Bar Kamsa begged to be spared the embarrassment of being evicted. He offered to pay for his meal. He then offered to pay for half the party, just so he didn't have to be publicly humiliated. He offered to pay for the whole party. And the host didn't compromise, and Bar Kamsa was evicted. Not one of the rabbis protested. Bar Kamsa, embarrassed and humiliated, plotted his revenge not against the host, but against the entire Jewish people, even though he himself was a Jew. When a Roman official sent an animal to be sacrificed to the temple, Bar Kamsa subtly maimed the animal, knowing the rabbis overseeing the sacrifice would likely disqualify it as an offering, because the offering had to be a pure, unblemished sacrifice. So as the Talmud tells the story, the rabbis who oversaw the temple worship, they debated, should we accept the animal nonetheless from the Roman official, breaking the law this one time for the greater good, that is, not to inflame the Roman officials. And then Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkolis was a stickler for rules. The law should not be set aside, he insisted. Instead, the sacrifice was rejected, the Romans were infuriated, and the Roman war machine moved into motion and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Therefore, this rabbinic story concludes: Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. Why? Because of an ethical violation within the Israelite community. In other words, contrary to casting themselves as victims, the rabbis writing and recording this story chose to look internally and face what responsibility should they bear. What moral imperative do the rabbis point to that was so compromised that it brought about the destruction of their holy temple in Jerusalem? The moral imperative is to do everything possible to uphold a person's dignity. Embarrassment and humiliation are likened in Judaism to death. Think for a moment, perhaps you can relate to this. Perhaps you've been in Bar Kamsa's shoes, where someone, either intentionally, as is the case in our story, or unintentionally, strips you of your dignity, publicly lays you bare. What do? Most likely you blush. It's an evolutionary trait unique to human beings. When we are humiliated, it's hard to cover it up. Our body language takes over. Our face turns red, perhaps some nervous laughter, slumped shoulders. Humiliation mentally and physically lowers our stature. The Hebrew expression is halvanat pnei chaver, literally making the face of another turn white. Blushing soon ends. Blood drains from our face, and we turn pale. Of course, the person who is embarrassed and humiliated may well have transgressed themselves, and they are feeling the shame that comes from that. That's part of being human. Each of us knows shame. It's a motivation to get us back on track. We call that process in Judaism teshuvah. It's the path of return. Yet our Bar Kamsa story is the flip side of that coin. It's not only the sin of one person intentionally humiliating another, when there was actually an opportunity to seek a path of peace and reconciliation. It's a communal blind eye to the transgression. In this case, it's the rabbis, the torch bearers of morality in the community, who see Bar Kamsa's humiliation and mortification as his face first turns red, then ashen white, and they choose to do nothing. Standing idly by the blood of our neighbor can have quite a cost. The story itself obviously has a tragic ending. Out of rage and being publicly humiliated, Bar Kamsa, a member of the Jewish community, seeks revenge against his community, plotting a strategy to turn the Romans against the Jews. And that's what we mourn. That's what makes Tisha B'Av the saddest day of the year. So is the rabbinic story historically true? In all due respect, I think the larger question, the question of historicity, is less important than what our sacred texts teach us in a religious message. Our sacred texts live and breathe because they bring us face to face with ourselves, the truth of real life challenges that speak to our human fallibility. The rabbis take this historical event, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and they use it to raise the value of critical self-reflection. The rabbis are bold enough to write a story at their own expense, using themselves as the fall guys to raise up a moral imperative in Judaism. The rabbis know well the pain and suffering the Jews have endured over thousands of years. Hatred that continues to raise its ugly head in the form of anti-Semitism. Yet even on the eve of Tisha B'Av, the rabbis model the gift that the Jews have brought to the world, embraced by all peoples of faith and brought to life through their own distinctive stories and rituals. Of course, as we observe Tisha B'Av beginning tomorrow night, we will mourn all that has befallen our people since we journeyed through the parchment of the Hebrew Bible that continues to plague us to this day. And at the same time, we celebrate the freedoms we have as Jews and people of faith living in America, the sovereign state of Israel, with whom we stand steadfastly with and never take for granted, for the enduring strength to turn our tsuris into a moral compass, while always holding close the prophetic vision, Ki v'simcha tetzeu uvashalom tuvalum. For in joy at some day, for in joy will we go out, and peace be spread across the land. Mountains and hills will burst into song, and the trees of the field will clap their hands.